the automated podcast.
So welcome back to another automated podcast episode. And as always, I'm your host, Marc Verbenkov. So on today's podcast, I have a discussion with Florin, who recently just published a paper that explores the problems of precarious situations that independent professionals can be faced with. So though this episode deals less with technology or automation, I think it's actually quite an important topic for a number of reasons. So the first is that a number of my previous guests, as well as my future guests, actually fit into this category of independent professionals that's discussed in the paper. And secondly, it's actually the fastest growing job category out there, even though it hardly existed only a few decades ago. So as we discuss in this episode, we expect that this form of work will continue to grow as time goes on, with technological change being one of the key factors enabling this growth. But there are a couple others which Louis does a great job in explaining. So Louis himself is a Ph.D. candidate and researcher at the LENTIC, which is a multidisciplinary lab on technology, innovation, and change within organizations and the labor market. So after completing a bachelor in social sciences at the University of Liège, he graduated in a double degree master program from the University of Liège and Maastricht University, which is actually where we met and studied together during the first part of our master's program. So Louis is now conducting a PhD on new forms of employment with a specific interest in employment protection reforms. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's discussion, as I not only had a great time in this discussion with Louis, but also found his points very insightful. So hi there, Louis. Thanks for coming on to the Automated podcast.
Hi, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about my research and to share it with your listeners here.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get into it in just a second. I mean, you did have this article that was published, I think, 6-7 days ago. But I want to discuss or ask you, I guess, kind of your interest in the work that you're doing, in the research that you're doing overall. In the emails that we've been having back and forth and the discussion beforehand, you were talking that your interest lies in kind of the evolution of new forms of work or the evolution of employment statuses. Maybe you can just touch on your own motivation on that, because I always think that that's something that's interesting for listeners to hear about.
Yeah, exactly. So my interest lies in the evolution of employment arrangements and industrial relations in the last years, and especially with societal, technological, and economical changes that we observe now. And so what we are observing is the blurring of the boundary between self-employment and salaried work. And so that's the whole point of my thesis, to explore the blurring of the boundary and how does that lead to new forms of employment, and what does that mean for the workers concerned in terms of the experience they have at work, in terms of autonomy and so on, and also in terms of security and social protection, for example, in the second part.
Yeah.
So that's the whole the global interest of the thesis and this paper.
Yeah, and I think it comes at a really relevant time in kind of our world. Not discussing about COVID, but kind of the transformations that we see through the technologies that are coming about that are actually enabling these forms of autonomous work that you mentioned. So I think that the research that you're doing is, as I said, very relevant for this period of time.
Yeah, exactly. With the of course, the technological developments on one side, people are more able to work remotely, for example. Mm-hmm. They are able to collaborate online and so on. So employment is not anymore really linked to one workplace or a common working schedule. And we have more possibility for organizing our work autonomously. So that, of course, allows people to have different work arrangements that go outside of the traditional employment arrangements we have seen in the last decades.
Yep, yep. And I think that both of us would agree that this is something that's going to be continuing into the future as well. Actually, I think you mentioned this in your paper, so maybe we can jump into the paper. So you had this article that was published over the last week or so, which looks at the forms of precariousness related to autonomous work. Maybe you can discuss a little bit about the overall goal, about the paper. I have some specific questions that we'll get into, but maybe you can just introduce the paper and discuss the overall goal.
Sure. The paper, the goal of the paper was to study what we mean by this gray zone between self-employment and salaried work, and to study the actual experience of workers. And so to study this specific subject, we looked into the literature, and there are, we could say, two approaches. Like, there was the first approach, we would say, we have independent professionals. So that's the concept of IPROs, which are self-employed workers in the intellectual sectors. So that would be self-employed workers working as freelance for graphic design, for copywriting, translating, or IT work, or consultancy, and so on. So that would be self-employed workers in intellectual activities. We observe this group of workers are booming. It has been growing by 45% in the last decade in the EU. So this is the fastest growing workforce in the EU. So as I said, there are two approaches. There's this first take on this workforce that said, this is the future of work. These are highly autonomous workers that take a responsibility for their own protection, for their own security, that are completely autonomous, and so on. And there's a second part of the literature that would say, this is actually forced precarious work. People are pushed into self-employment because there are no salaried position, and this is linked to precarious work arrangements. And so what we wanted to do is to dive into that empirically by using the European Working Conditions Survey, and to provide, I think what we achieved to do is to provide a more nuanced view about that. Dive in the result later on. So that the more nuanced view is that we have approximately 60% of the IPROs that are actually what we see commonly with self-employed workers. So they are highly autonomous on their work methods, on their work pace. And they also, of course, have the responsibility that goes hand in hand with self-employment, meaning that they are responsible for their skills development, for example. They are responsible for their working conditions. And of course, they are responsible for generating their income. So that would be the traditional vision of self-employment that we see. But what was interesting is that we see there are two groups that differ from this traditional vision of self-employment we observe. These two groups are, first, the economically dependent IPROs, which are the ones that are highly economically dependent on one client, but also they lack autonomy on their work methods and work pace. So they have they do not have the upside of autonomy, and they also have the downside of autonomy, meaning that they are responsible for their own skills development, they are responsible for generating the income, and so on. We observe also a third group of about 20% of the population of the IPROs, which are the winners. They have the upsides of autonomy without having the downside. So they might be supported by a labor market intermediary or umbrella organization that provide them with skills development schemes and so on, that provide them with secure monthly income and so on, even though they enjoy a lot of autonomy on their work pace and methods. So that's the kind of picture we have with our analysis, is that we don't have, as it was the case in the literature, we don't have these IPOs are not all losers, they are not all winners. Most of them are normal self-employed workers that enjoy autonomy while having the responsibility that goes with it. But we observe that there are two groups of about 20% that differ from this main group, as they have all the the upsides and no downsides, and the others have no upside, all the downside that goes with autonomy. So that
I think that the distinctions that you make is actually really important. So in the podcast here, we've actually had a couple of these iPros or independent professionals coming on, and they've discussed more so the benefits of being an independent professional. But I think having kind of an objective perspective that you bring, and you clearly write in the article, and you've been speaking to now, it really shows that it's not such a rosy picture, right? That's painted. I think that the objectivity that you bring is actually very valuable for people that are thinking about these new forms of work and kind of what the future holds, especially as you mentioned, right? If this sector is growing, as you said, over the last decade, they've been growing by 45% in the EU. If we're going to see this continuing, right, I think it's very important to understand that it's not a perfect sector to go into, right? There are these, as you titled, precarious situations that these autonomous workers can fall into. Yeah,
I don't want the title to be misleading. And I think what we said is that all forms of all new forms of employment are precarious. That what we try to show is that for the majority it goes well, and for a small minority it goes very well. But it's what we try to show is that it's not all good forms of employment for everyone, and so we try to show that 20% of the population are actually might have been pushed to self-employment or enjoy or do experience high risks that goes with the condition.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. So I was reading the article before the discussion, and I thought that was an interesting point. It's something that actually hadn't occurred to me before, that typically the image that myself and I think many of the people that I discuss with, the image of an independent professional is somebody who chooses to take on this independent autonomous work. It's not necessarily somebody who is being pushed into it. I thought that was a really interesting point that you bring up in the article. Can you maybe talk to that point a little bit further?
Yeah, of course. There's actually in the European Working Conditions Survey a question which is based on if people say that they are self-employed workers. There's a question that asks them, if you're self-employed, was it mainly your own personal preference, or you had no better alternatives for work? And so that's this question that we use to look into the results. And we observe that in the group of economically dependent IPROs, half of them say that they choose self-employment because they had no alternative. It's not a personal preference. So while this is more something like 70 or 80% for the other self-employed workers, so that's also something that really differs from the traditional self-employment seen as something chosen. It's not necessarily someone that has been pushed towards self-employment, but it's for example in some sectors, I don't know, I don't have any precise example, but I don't know, maybe a graphic designer would see a post in a company, and they would say, yeah, for this position we only have contractual arrangements as a self-employed workers. We do not hire for that position. And that's the kind of things that might explain that result.
Well, also, I think, sorry to cut you off, but I also think that, I mean, we were discussing before the actual recording of this, that Uber might be a good example of that, right? If there are no other options, right, especially in, the declining economic reality that we're facing, but also heavily in the United States right now, Uber was one of the autonomous options that many people were able to take. If they had a vehicle, they would be able to become self-employed in order to make some sort of income.
Yeah, exactly. And Uber is really the specific organization everyone talks about when they talks about the precariousness of new forms of employment and self-employment. We have all these legal debates about Uber, like is a Uber driver a self-employed worker, or is he salaried? So those are all the legal debates about subordination, like are they subordinated to Uber or not? That's of course a really interesting debate. I'm not a jurist, and so we were not talking about are these people subordinated or not. And I think even in our category of economically dependent IPROs, this is not sufficient to say that they are subordinated to an employer. And that they are these people are actually in a bogus self-employment, for example. But this shows that the boundary between self-employment and salaried work is really blurry, and it's actually more a continuum than two different categories.
And this is the gray zone that you discuss in your article, right?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
the blurring of these boundaries ends up being
exactly. And,
on a spectrum.
The argument is that this blurring is growing, so that the salaried workers are more and more autonomous in their work, and we can observe that more and more salaried workers are more and more controlled on their result than on their work processes, for example. And it's more linked to what have been traditionally the way of controlling self-employed workers or contractors than controlling salaried workers.
I want to jump in here for a second. This goes maybe a little bit beyond what you have in your article, but from your own personal point of view, do you maybe have an idea as to why this is growing?
I do not have a precise idea, but I've been also looking into the literature for that, and I think we can observe four main reasons for the development of new forms of employment. There's first, there has been a lot of changes in the economy in the last decades. We have more of an economy that is focused on or based on service than industry, while it was more based on industry after World War II, for example. And of course, the industry works with much more control and so on than a service economy. Second hand, we have the transformations into the organization of work. So organizations, as I said earlier, execute more control on the outcomes than on the process as it was before, and management has changed as well. A third source of explanation may be that individual motivations and social aspirations are changing. People want to organize their life more autonomously. They want to work remotely. They want to have flexible schedule and so on. So that's also another point of explanation. And fourth, and I think that's the one which is more linked to this podcast, is technological change. So technological change and digitalization in the last years have also given the opportunity for people and organizations to make these motivations and these aspirations and these change in the management possible. So that would be the four kind of explanations we can see.
Terrific. Well, for somebody who didn't necessarily have a great answer, you certainly outlined it well enough for me. That's great. Thanks. Maybe we can jump back to the article a little bit. So you discussed a few of the kind of precarious aspects of the iPros work. The one that I thought that was really interesting was that, of course, certain iPros don't necessarily choose their work. I also read that some have only one specific client. Maybe you can touch on that and discuss a few of the other different aspects.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I said, having one client only is not does not mean that they are not autonomous, or that does not mean they are subordinated. But that's of course a risk the self-employed worker takes, because if they have only one client, when that client leaves, then you don't have any source of income. And if you're not if you have not taken insurance and so on, then you're without income, which is not the case for salaried workers, because they have access to the social security. And we know in most countries the social security for self-employed workers is way lower than for salaried workers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the dimensions of autonomy, but that's not the main explanation. But that's of course linked to a lot of risk for many workers. But it also depends on the sector in which you work as well, because we know for a fact, at least in Belgium, that a lot of IT workers actually work as self-employed workers because they prefer to have that autonomy and to switch project most of the time. But it's because they are in a high position in the labor market. They have a low supply and a high demand for their skills, so they can take that risk of being economically dependent from one company for one project, because they know that they can switch easily. But that's not the case for every type of worker. So of course the kind of sector in which you work in does have a lot of impact as well on the amount of security you have.
Are there any other points that you want to talk about the precarious aspects? Because I think that's part of the title of your article, but I also think that it's the kind of interesting and relevant points that are kind of new to the topics that we've talked about on the podcast.
I think I explained most of it. Of course, okay. We will not dive into all the details and so on, and everyone that is interested in it can have a look at the article and takes what is interested in.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll have the link to the article on the show notes of the episode as well, so not to worry. Okay, so then maybe what are some of the solutions to these precarious aspects? And I think this might fit into your continuing interest and your continuing research on the reforms in employment protections. So maybe you can talk to that a bit.
Of course. So what I'm working on now is how we can provide institutional solutions to the risk that are taken by workers in new forms of employment. So of course there are not only institutional and political solutions. There are we can observe labor market intermediaries and umbrella organizations that provide self-employed workers with help, assistance, and security. But what I've been interested in the last months is the debates about how to regulate new forms of employment. So I've been looking into the how the European social partners, so the European organizations that defend the employers and the European organization that defends the workers, have been debating the topic. And as I said earlier in this podcast, we have 4 modes of explanation of the development of new forms of employment. So there's transformation in the economy, there's organizational change and management change. We have a change in the individual motivations, and we have technological change and digitalization. And of course, we can observe that the social partners do not have the same mode of explanation. We observe that the European Union, for example, explained the development of such forms of employment more with economic explanation, saying that this has been due to transformation in the economy and deregulation of the labor market as well, while the employer side say this is more linked to transformation in the management and also individual motivations. People want to work more flexibly and want to work more autonomous. And of course, there are different solutions that are proposed by the actors. Some people calls for a 3rd category, for example, so an intermediate category. This is already the case in Italy with parasubordinati workers. This is the case in Canada. It's not really a 3rd category, but some protections are granted to dependent contractors. It is the case in Spain as well. There is an intermediate category for dependent contractors. That's not. I don't recall the name.
Autonomous.
Autonomous. Yeah. Okay. Exactly. And so that has been debated a lot by experts and jurists, and most people agree that actually this does not offer more protection to self-employed workers, but actually it contributes to shifting more salaried work into that intermediate category.
Mm.
So that has been debated, and it's now also criticized because instead of one boundary, now we have two boundaries. So
Right.
that also complexifies the legal definition of an employment relation. And now people are more looking into how can we offer more social protection to self-employed workers and new forms of employment. And we have the first possibility, which is to provide a universal social protection, a social protection that would be the same for self-employed workers or salaried workers. This position is defended by the unions, for example, the European unions, and it's not defended by, for example, the representative of the self-employed workers that want to keep their own social protection, and I want to also keep it based on the needs of the self-employed workers. They say that not all self-employed workers needs to have a social protection, or at least not all branches of social protection, and they can choose what they need as protection, and that risk taking is also part of entrepreneurship. That's also a big debate. Do we have to offer protection to these workers, as self-employed and entrepreneurship is inherently a risk-taking activity? So that's also a bit of the debate right now.
Do you have any best estimate as to how long these debates will take to find some sort of clarity, or do you think that this is just a continuous debate that needs to be had as this growing sector continues to grow over the next decade or two?
I think actually at the European level, the debate is vivid quite right now. We have the debates about the European Pillar of Social Rights, which the European Commission wants to make sure that every forms of employment have access to basic levels of social protection, and they are debating the measures right now at the European level, and I think the COVID-19 crisis will also push the debates about that, or at least that's one of my guess. And I don't know how long it will take, but this is certainly a hot topic right now. We have seen the International Labour Organization has also changed the international classification of situations in employment to add this category of dependent contractors. So recognizing that there is a kind of a blurring of the boundary between self-employment and salaried work. So no, the problem is that the debate is complex because every country has its own definitions and its own jurisdiction regarding forms of employment. So it's complicated to have this debate at the European level, but I think that's the way forward, and that's the way that should be developed in the future.
I mean, I think the complexity is quite enormous between the different European member states, but then also, I mean, this isn't just a European issue. This is a global issue. As
of course, because my work has been focused on the European level, and
yes.
I'm not really aware of the debates everywhere, but that's a global debate, of course.
So I think that the complexity is going to be that much more as every, at least Western industrialized country, is going to have to deal with these issues more and more as time goes on. The actual last question that I had written down here for you was how the COVID crisis is actually going to impact that. But I think you already discussed or pointed to the fact that this crisis is actually going to accelerate these debates, or maybe even bring more attention to these debates. I don't know if there's...
because I think it makes visible the precariousness of some situation. I guess there are a lot of iPros, for example, that now discover that actually having one client was actually a risk, because their client now say that they can work with them anymore, or so on, and they do not have social protection because they are self-employed, or they have a very limited social protection. So I think this crisis has made visible some of the the precarious situations that are associated with these forms of employment. Not saying that they are all precarious, but saying that the ones that were precarious have been made visible by the COVID-19 crisis. And so, yeah, my guess is that this will probably accelerate the debates about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. So I think also the timing of your paper, I don't know if you chose to publish it at this time or not, but I think
was
it's
not intended because
yeah.
I submitted it last year and it took 1 year to review it and make modification and so on. So it is not on purpose, but I think it's about time now to.
Yeah. Well, you could definitely get away with saying that it was on purpose if you wanted to push that out there. Those were the main things that I wanted to discuss with you today. I know that you're on LinkedIn, and I'll have your contact details up on there as well. Do you maybe want to mention the research group that you're with, or where anybody else can get in touch with you, or the work that you're doing with your colleagues?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm working at LENTIC, which is LENTIC. It's a laboratory studying new forms of employment, technology, innovation, and change. So it's based at the Faculty of Management of HEC Liège, which is part of the University of Liège. If you're interested in all those kinds of topics, you can have a look at our website, which I can send the link on lentic.uliege.be, and you can also follow my work on LinkedIn or ResearchGate, and yeah, hope you enjoyed it.
Perfect. Yeah, I absolutely enjoyed the conversation. You're very knowledgeable on the subject, and it was great to have you on. And maybe if you come out with another article in the next year or so, I'll have you back to discuss maybe the reforms that are being brought up in the employment protection as you discussed.
Okay. Thank you.
Terrific.
I'll let you know.
Terrific.
Thank you for inviting me. It
Absolutely.
has been an interesting experience for me to speak on the podcast, and to talk about my work was a great opportunity.
Terrific. Well, happy to have you on. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. If you want to support the podcast, you can leave a like or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you want to get in touch, feel free to do so over Twitter or LinkedIn by searching for Automated Podcast. On the website, automatedpodcast.org, you can leave a comment on any of the episodes, read the transcripts, and look at the sources I use in all of these episodes. There are also blog articles and additional resources and information on this topic, and podcast if you are looking for more. See you next week.
The Automated Podcast.